Nurse?
The call of a biographer with a distended bladder.
Nurse?
A would-be biographer, my would-be biographer, who lies parcelled in polythene in the burns unit of Fulham Hospital.
Is anyone there?
No. It is typical of Timothy Liripet to seek relief when the auxiliaries are on strike, the nurses are demonstrating, and the clerical officer attempting to cope in their place has entangled himself in an intravenous drip.
Nurse!
I watch, a shadow in an unmade bed, the pallid shadow of a man with no memorial who has perished as if he had never been. And I smile as he squirms in his puddled paper sheet.
Broomhouse Reach, a suite in 6 movements by Colin McLaren, with David de Keyser as Mendel and Timothy Davies as Liripet. First movement, New Light on an Old Master.
Hey, Mendel, some guy's going to give a talk about you.
Thus, 12 months ago, I first heard of Liripet in the twilit hall of temporary residence I inhabit with my fellow forgotten men of letters, science, and the arts, awaiting the biography that will transform our obscurity into renown, the boxed set of recordings that will translate us to one of the many mansions where there are draft-proof doors and drinkable port.
New Light, it says here, on the composer Martin Mendel, 1870 to 1947, and his neglected role in the renaissance of English music.
My informant was Nigel Scrote, until recently a junior fellow of All Hallows, ill-bred and undernourished. His face cratered like the Menin Road, with acne. He is always first to the Times, which arrives a day late with the crossword completed.
No slagging, it's a fact.
Quite. A Scrote has not the imagination for fiction. He calls himself a structuralist and has analysed music from Machaut to Mahler into columns, brackets and graphs.
Your turn had to come, mind. They're all pissed off with English pastoral. There's only English suburban left.
Envy, but understandable. Scrote, who had without conscience disemboweled a dozen masters for a publisher in Dortmund, objected over-conscientiously to war and froze to death in a peace camp near High Wickham. His publishers cut him out of their list almost before the undertakers had cut him out of his sleeping bag, and Scrote remains, in consequence, forgotten and forlorn.
Bunch of neo-Nazis. Oh, nothing personal, like.
Quite. He insists that I am German. I was born in a second-class coach of the Österreichische Staatseisenbahn when my father, a clarinetist of repute, travelled with my heavily pregnant mother from a musical engagement in Prague to another in Dresden. The unexpected incursion of a customs officer at 2 in the morning on the frontier at Bodenbach sent her into labour with complications less of an obstetric than a territorial nature, which were not resolved until my father travelled on to a further engagement with August Mans at the Crystal Palace, and was the first to avail himself of the newly passed Naturalization of Aliens Act. I am, therefore, English. Moreover, I am an English legal precedent. But to Scrote, I remain irrevocably German. The lecture, my dear fellow. When and where?
Hang about. Yeah, tonight. Broomhouse, SW somewhere.
Where I lived in a red brick terrace until my parents succumbed to the miasma that overhung the market gardens nearby.
The Institute of Further Education.
Formerly my board school, still providing, it seemed, instruction for the illiterate by the incompetent in the irrelevant.
At 7:30.
When I became a patch of mould on a classroom wall where once there had been a map of the empire.
Excuse me. You're sitting on my programme. Ladies. That's all right. Ladies.
40 camel-clad buttocks and approximately the same number of cashmere-covered breasts subsided like a desert caravan at rest.
Welcome to the fourth meeting of the Broomhouse Music Appreciation Society. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Timothy Liripet of the Centre for British Music.
All brow and chin with more arms and legs than he knew what to do with.
You will see from your programme that his talk is upon the composer Mendel, once an inhabitant of Broomhouse, and is to be illustrated by tape recordings and slides. Unfortunately, Dr. Liripet has brought the wrong tape.
No, it's the right tape, but it's a cassette.
And his slide projector does not work.
Well, actually it does, but
He
your plugs
intends
around
to make
here.
use of the piano instead. If the caretaker can find the key. Dr. Liripet.
Thank you. Ladies and ladies.
The opening bars were tentative, but the theme was clearly stated.
Mendel receives no more than a mention in the New Grove, yet his music merits serious consideration, equalling, at the least, that accorded to the work of his riverside contemporary, Holst. You are familiar, no doubt, with his orchestral suite, On Four Bridges?
They were not.
But what of his string quartet, his serenade for wind band, his rhapsody for two pianos? None is recorded, none is ever broadcast. Not even late at night on Radio 3. Yet these works, the only ones that I have found in print, though I'm certain that others exist, are exquisite, containing elements of early Impressionism, a folk song revival, and English pastoral, transmuted into something quite unique.
Excuse me's have inevitably punctuated and punctured my share of glory, laud, and honour, as in 1884 in this very school when the headmaster, commending my skill upon strings, brass, and woodwinds, was interrupted by a monitor.
Excuse me, sir. 5 shillings in Mendel's desk, sir, at the picnic fund.
This time, however, it was merely the caretaker.
You'd like the piano open now?
Not immediately. You see, I'm just outlining
Righto
the...
then. The key's somewhere on this ring. 2. No, that's your boiler room.
How kind of you, Mr. Filbert. And how is Mrs. Filbert?
Oh, mustn't grumble. 4. That's your audio visuals. She's having her kneecap scraped.
Oh, dear.
5. That's the ladies' what's it. Oh, the door's sticking again, by the way. Just lift it and push.
Right.
6. That's the one. There you are.
Thank you very much. Mendel's music, then, is...
You can have it moved near if you like.
No,
There's
I think
trouble.
it's fine.
Oh, excuse me, it's no trouble.
Well,
Except for
if you're sure.
my hernia. I was a month in hospital, I was with that last time.
I really cannot see why you should want the piano moved, Dr. Liripet.
But I didn't. I just thought that
Mr. Filbert has other things to do than rearrange the furniture to suit you.
Oh, yes, I know. I
Perhaps
only...
you might now resume.
You can imagine my apprehension. Here I had a champion, sensitive enough to perceive that I was something quite unique, who nevertheless displayed before a camel and a caretaker the characteristics of one sentenced to go upon his belly, eating dust all the days of his life.
Right then, I'll leave you all to it. Now, you won't forget the ladies' what's it. Remember? Lift and push, right?
Right.
As the talk progressed, Liripet compounded with his ineffectuality an innocence no less disturbing. Passing briefly over my parentage, youthful poverty, and board school peculations, he proceeded to my early employment with a publisher of romantic ballads and my imaginative manipulation of the postage book.
Mendel was saved from conviction through the intercession of the firm's most notable client, the composer and popular performer of romantic ballads, Emmeline Tute.
I wish to inform the court that the young man is a talented musician. Indeed, I believe that it was in order to afford lessons in composition that he committed these and earlier irregularities, and I have, in consequence, obtained for him a position in the orchestra of the Orphean Hall, the institution in which I myself am privileged to perform.
Thank you, Miss Tute. The court is of the opinion that such a course will indubitably lead to his moral and artistic elevation. Case dismissed.
There was nothing moral about the elevations that Emmeline had in mind, though some of them were undeniably artistic. I was elevated in her dressing room every afternoon until 5, when she would ease her 12 glistening stones into a dress of virginal white silk and sweep on stage to sing serenely, "My loved one sleeps," while her loved one slumped in the orchestra pit, endeavoring not to.
Mendel joined the Orphean as a lowly violinist, but shortly afterwards, on the initiative of another of its stars, Euphemia Craw,
Emmeline's fiercest rival.
I've always admired her, ever since I was a child.
Mendel was appointed second clarinet.
Effie was as angular as Emmy was rotund, as sparse as Emmy was bountiful, but in their passion they were indistinguishable. I was merely exchanging, so to speak, tooth for claw.
Mendel was promoted again to first clarinet.
Emmy doubling the bid.
And soon afterwards to the first violin.
Effie redoubling.
Then, in the season of 1890, he was appointed leader.
Having descended, not without regret, from Emmy's undulating plains and Effie's scarps and ridges to the arid scrub land of the manager's wife.
We despise nowadays the paternalism of the Victorians, yet one cannot but admire the Mrs. Tute and Craw and the management of the Orphean for their disinterested encouragement of the young musician.
You see what I mean? Ineffectual and innocent, and inept. For dismissing my earliest compositions,
a score of trumpery ballads for Sims Reeves and Antoinette Sterling.
Liripet turned to my serious music.
The pieces I have traced are all pictures of London. Not the exuberant London of Elgar's Cockaigne, nor the tranquil London of Vaughan Williams' Symphony, nor the boisterous London of Holst's Hammersmith. And Mendel's London is, in contrast, one of shabby streets, of flaking facades looming through winter fogs. You won't find George or Harris frolicking in a boat along Mendel's riverside, but Jack the Ripper could be slinking from any of his slovenly squares. Mendel, in short, composed what his contemporary Sickert painted.
A most gratifying analogy, which he then insisted upon illustrating on the Institute's piano, prompting the camel, evidently of greater sensitivity than I had previously imagined, to propose an early vote of thanks and head a rush to the water-hole.
Coffee, Doctor?
She was in her 70s, but with all the keys intact, and clearly intent upon a private exchange with my champion, I became a streak of rust upon the urn.
No, I won't, thanks.
Nor would Mendel. Said the English and their coffee put him in mind of the folk in the Bible that drank their own piss. Shocking thing to say in them days, mind. Spray it on a wall now and they put it in a paper bag.
You knew Mendel?
He knew my mother.
Well?
He meant socially.
Too well.
She meant carnally.
I'm sorry, I don't think I know your name.
Wicks, Doctor. Mrs. Wicks. Your Mendel was my father.
I didn't know Mendel had a daughter.
Nor did Mendel.
I mean, I checked naturally, but there was
Oh,
no...
my old mum never troubled the Registrar General with me. Never troubled Mendel neither. She had her pride.
That should have eased the effort of identification. Emmy and Effie and their successors had none. But study as I might the beaked nose and sharpened chin, I could not find a face that fitted.
Ah. You wouldn't, by virtue of the relationship, I mean, actually possess any of Mendel's manuscripts?
Why, I'm here, innit? 40. You want to see him, Doctor?
Very much.
Tomorrow morning, then. Broomhouse Mansions. Block C. Name's on the door.
Fine. Right. Fine.
Broomhouse Mansions was a block of apartments built of brick and stucco for those who could not afford the rents of Maida Vale and Barron's Court, including a lady demonstrator from the Aeolian Piano Player Company, whom I visited regularly there in the summer of '91. I joined Liripet nostalgically in the vestibule, a smear of wax on the purple tiles.
Ow, it's you. Why till I do the chain?
I preceded Liripet into the sitting room, became a cobweb on the crumbling dado, then stared, as he stared, at the pile of manuscripts on the piano.
Mendel's?
Undeniably. But how?
Found when my old mum passed away. Winter 62 done it. We took over her flat here. They was in a box along with his snap.
Cabinet Portrait by mail of Piccadilly.
Might be worth something, Mr. Wicks said. He was in government surplus in Edmonton. See us through the eventide home, anyway. Not they done him much good.
Is he...
Cancer of the bowel. Size of a grapefruit, they said.
And you've lived here alone ever since?
Right. But now I fancy a change. I mean, there was some nice Jewish families when we come and your district officers and that kicked out the colonies. But the last few years it's been your colours. Doctors and lawyers mainly. I'm nothing against them personally. But if I had, it'd be nice to be able to say so. Know what I mean? So, if you want to do anything with my dad's music...
Her dad's music, when I had not yet made a formal identification of her mum?
It's going to cost you, right?
Understood. Did your mother ever mention Mendel?
Once, just before she passed over. There was fire engines come to Broom Cottage and she got ever so upset. That was Mr. Mendel's house, she kept saying. The composer. Funny, really, because she was never much of a one for music. Well, 100 best tunes she liked and Richard Baker, but none of your moderners. Then, when we saw the snap...
Inscribed by my hand, but to whom and in return for what, I could not now remember.
Mr. Wicks said, that's it. This Mendel was your old man. Oh, not that he ever held it against me being, you know, very broad-minded, Mr. Wicks. You had to be in government surplus.
I suppose so.
That was when we started to ask around a bit. No one remembered much about Mendel, except he had a tongue like a flick knife.
Was Broom Cottage destroyed?
No, still see it from the bedroom. In here.
I followed them and became a trace of blight upon the fuchsia at the window.
There. Mess, innit? Seen garden sheds come through the blips in better nick.
It had been built as a studio by a prominent member of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, who had subsequently lacked the art and craft to dispose of it, and I had bought it cheaply in the summer of '92.
Is it structurally sound?
Need a surveyor to tell you that, but even the rats wear helmets.
And does all that ground belong to it?
Yeah. Of course it was nicer before the trees went.
Elm disease?
Arson. That's why the engines come.
It was here that I ceased to dabble in ballads and styled myself composer for the first time, in order to seduce a friend of my piano player, who was in turn a friend of Ethel Smythe.
Fires every week till they close the primary school down.
I took as my first models the new British masters, and would spend my free evenings at concerts of the Philharmonic Society, where their music was now regularly heard. Then I would return to Broomhouse, the rhapsodies of Mackenzie, the symphonies of Stanford and Parry, reverberating in my head as the omnibus rattled over unfinished suburban roads.
Seen enough, have you?
Fine, thanks. May I examine the manuscripts?
Suit yourself.
But theirs was not, I decided, the music I wanted to write. It was full-bodied stuff, all buttoned up in a tight white waistcoat. I spoke grandly instead, to the friend of Ethel Smythe, of evocation and impression, of Stimmung and Bilder, then found I didn't know how to begin.
This seems to be the earliest. Nocturne, 1893.
But one evening, I stood outside my cottage and let the sounds of the waterfront, muted by the river mist, seep into my head. The slow sucking of the Thames beneath Broomhouse Wharf, the grinding of the barges there as they rose upon the tide, the rattle of a derrick, the creak of tarpaulins, the low whistle of a watchman, fearful lest he raise the ghosts of drowned watermen. And these became my music. Rhythms at first, then notes, then phrases, then long melodic lines and skeins of harmony, too subtle to capture, too complex to unravel. But I wrote down what I could remember, and listening later to what I had written, I stifled every superfluous note.
Any good, is it?
Oh, it was good, all right, and Liripet was musician enough to know it. I was with him that night, a scatter of crumbs in his Reigate flat, when he dictated a report to his director.
Right. Felicity, where were we? Yes, paragraph 3. I have examined only a fraction of the music, comma, owing to Mrs. Wicks's insistence, with an E, you got it wrong last week, upon payment, stop. Actually, when I say you got it wrong, it's perfectly possible that I didn't pronounce it very clearly or didn't spell it in full or something, so don't worry, it probably wasn't your fault. Where was I? Oh, yes. But I saw enough to be certain that it spans Mendel's entire career as a composer, comma, representing his lyrical period, comma, his impressionism, and his interest in folk-song, stop. You know, I'm not absolutely sure that it is spelt with an E. Perhaps you could check. Right. Most interesting of all, however, is the work from his later years, which seems to me to combine the intensity of Delius with the delicacy of Ireland and astringency of Walton. In pursuance of the Centre's policy for publicising the lesser-known composers of the English Renaissance, I offer the following suggestions. 1. That the Centre purchases the music from Mrs. Wicks and arranges for its performance. 2. That a critical biography of Mendel be issued as one of the Centre's occasional publications. 3. That Mendel's cottage in Broomhouse be refurbished partly as a museum, partly for recitals, on the lines of our Frederick Corder room at Eastbourne, our Ebenezer Prout room at Hackney, and our Hamish McCunn room at Greenock. Or is it Greenock? Not that it matters in a letter, actually, but I think it's spelt Greenock. Right, Felicity, finish it off in the usual way. Top copy to the director, Xeroxes to the trustees.
Just what a man...
Tell you what, Felicity, don't use insistence. Think of something else.
Just what a man without a memorial wanted to hear. And the director's reply, I was a pool of liquid paper on Liripet's desk at the Centre when it came, was equally heartening.
My dear Liripet, your estimable suggestions were considered by the trustees, who made the following decisions. Purchase of Mendel's manuscripts, agreed, but only if, as I fear, Mrs. Wicks cannot be persuaded of her obligation to scholarship, etc. A biography, agreed. It should be scholarly, but succinct. Mendel is not, after all, Haydn, and you are not Robbins Landon. Mendel's house, the condition and title should be investigated, but no more. Remember that the rooms of Corder and Company were provided by the local authorities. We merely provided memorabilia. It is unlikely that we can take further action without the assistance of the Borough Council, to say nothing, and I should prefer to say nothing, of commercial sponsorship.
Overleaf, however, the temperature dropped.
A word concerning your fellowship, which is due for renewal next year. While aware of your assiduity in cataloguing the Centre's collections, the trustees lack the reassurance of a weighty work. I use the word qualitatively from your pen. I understand that one learned journal lost your article on Granville Bantock, that another ceased publication before your paper on Rutland Boughton could appear, and that the publisher of your study of Sterndale Bennett is now in the hands of a receiver. I sympathize. Nevertheless, the trustees will require more than 2 short talks on Music Weekly to convince them of your undoubted ability, and a successful outcome to your new project is therefore most earnestly advocated. Yours ever, Hubert Fiske.
In other words, Laura, Mendel is my last chance.
Liripet had immediately telephoned his wife in Oxford, where she and 30 other socio-psychologists were in conference. I listened, a beading of sweat upon the mouthpiece.
Laura, can you hear all right? It's me, Tim.
Who else? I was on the point of persuading the head of the Clinical Research Council and an undersecretary from the DHSS to fund my unit for a further 3 years when I was called to the phone. As I looked over my shoulder and saw them disperse, irretrievably, I said to myself, it can only be Tim. No one else could blight the future of an entire research team with a single phone call.
I tried to envisage Laura, Garbo, in spectacles, her breasts tipped with broken glass.
But you do understand, it's serious. I'll have to immerse myself.
Preferably in acid.
In this project. It will mean spending a lot of time away from the flat. In Broomhouse. In case you need me for anything, I mean.
Can you pay the salaries of 3 research staff, a statistician, a systems analyst, and 2 typists?
No, of course I can't.
I don't need you. But there are 3 speakers who need me. I'm chairing the plenary session. So if you would kindly replace the receiver.
But Laura... Hell.
Hath no fury like a woman interrupted in the middle of a hard sell, as I remarked to Scrote that night.
Poor sod. He remains puzzled, undecided, and dallies with his purpose till the occasion is lost. Hazlitt on Hamlet.
The resemblance had not escaped me, and the common room suddenly grew colder. With Liripet as Hamlet, and myself encumbered by a black and midnight bastard of anonymous maternity as Lear, what should have been a history was turning irredeemably into a tragedy.
New Light on an Old Master was the first movement of Broomhouse Reach, a suite in 6 movements, written by Colin McLaren and directed by Piers Plowright. David de Keyser was Mendel, Timothy Davies, Liripet, Fanny Carby, Mrs. Wicks, and Cyril Luckham, Sir Hubert Fiske. Mark Jones was Nigel Scrote, Maggie McCarthy, Laura, Monica Gray, the chairwoman, and Keith Smith, Eileen Tully, and Michael Bilton played everybody else. The Broomhouse Reach music was composed and conducted by Paul Patterson.
Felicity, will you type this out for the director? Oh, by the way, persistence isn't the same as insistence. At least I don't think it is. And it's spelt with an E, I think. Well, actually, I'm not absolutely certain. Well, don't worry about it. Perhaps I shouldn't have sprung it on you like that anyway. Where was I? Oh, yes, the director.
The piano nocturne in that first episode of Broomhouse Reach was played by Nigel Clark, and the voice of the celebrated soprano Emmeline Tute by Elizabeth Spriggs. The next movement, Deep Plots in a Depressed Area, can be heard next Friday evening at 7 o'clock here on Radio 3.